clock ticks. Every second is a reminder that time is always moving forward. What would you do if you realized you had all the time in the world, but no way to change how you spent it? Could you go back and make different choices? Could you undo the mistakes that have haunted you for years? What if you could change your entire life by understanding the true power of time? Imagine this. A person just like you standing at a crossroads. They've tried everything to find happiness, to make something of themselves, yet no matter how hard they worked, something always seemed to slip away. Their past felt like a chain, each link holding them back, preventing them from moving forward. It's easy to think that the key to success is money, fame, or accomplishments, but what if the key was something more simple, something you already have at your fingertips? This is the story of one person who discovered that the most powerful resource in the world is not something you can buy, but something you can never get back: time. It was a quiet morning when this individual, like so many of us, found themselves staring out the window, watching life pass by. They'd spent years chasing after fleeting dreams, running in circles, trying to prove something to the world. But the truth was, they had spent so much time chasing that they never stopped to understand what really mattered. Time wasn't just a countdown to something. Time was the answer. It wasn't until they hit rock bottom that the realization came. The weight of their mistakes and the pressure of unfulfilled dreams bore down on them. For the first time they thought about how precious time really was. Each day, each hour, each minute that slipped by without meaning was time they could never get back. The things they thought were important, money, success, recognition, suddenly didn't feel so significant. It was the moments they had lost, the people they had let go, the dreams they had neglected that weighed on their heart. And they knew deep down that if they didn't change how they spent their time, they would end up lost forever. But how could they? How could someone who had spent so long chasing the wrong things suddenly shift their focus? How could they start over, especially when so much time had already been wasted? The answer wasn't simple, and it certainly wasn't easy. It began with a single decision, a small but powerful realization that they had the power to make time work for them. But before they could even begin to understand how to use this power, they were faced with a challenge unlike anything they'd ever experienced before. Their life was about to take a turn they couldn't have predicted, and the lessons they would learn along the way would change everything. In this journey, they would face obstacles that seemed insurmountable. They would encounter moments of doubt and fear that made them question everything. But the question remained: could they truly harness the power of time and change their life, or would they continue to be trapped in the cycle of regrets and missed opportunities? And as they began to take the first steps on this path, something unexpected happened. They realized that time, while powerful, wasn't the only force at play. There was something deeper, something more profound that was shaping their journey. But what was it? And how could they unlock it? As the story unfolds, you'll witness a life transformed by the power of time, by the decisions made in the quiet moments and the lessons learned in the hardest times. But there's a catch. This transformation didn't come without sacrifice. And not everyone is ready to pay the price for a new beginning. Are you ready to find out what happens next? To discover how this person will change their life, and maybe, just maybe, how you can change yours too. Stay tuned, because the next part of this story will leave you wondering if you're truly making the most of your own time. Time is ticking, and what you do with it could change everything. The sun began to set, casting an orange hue across the sky. The fading light mirrored the feeling in their heart. Something was slipping away, something they couldn't put into words. Time felt like it was closing in, and they could hear the ticking of the clock in their head, louder with each passing day. The weight of the choices they had made, the paths they had taken, all of it began to feel like too much. It was as though the universe had been telling them for years that they were on the wrong course, but they had never been able to listen, until now. They had always been a person who kept moving forward, even when it felt like they were walking in circles. It was almost as if they thought that if they just kept going, if they just worked harder, life would eventually make sense. But as they stood there looking at the world outside their window, they realized how much time had passed, how much they had given up, how much they had failed to appreciate. It was almost as if life had been a race, and they had spent so much energy trying to outrun everyone else, they forgot to enjoy the journey. It wasn't the big moments that haunted them. It was the small ones, the moments that slipped through their fingers like sand. The lunch with an old friend they had cancelled because they were too busy. The walk in the park they had put off for weeks. The phone calls they never made. It was all those little pieces of time that, when added together, made up a life. And now, all of them were lost. But what could they do about it now? The past was the past after all. They couldn't go back and redo things, no matter how badly they wished they could. Or could they? They had heard whispers about a man, a strange, mysterious figure who supposedly knew how to harness the power of time. The rumors were scattered, vague, and hard to believe, but the more they thought about it, the more the idea gripped them. If they could find this person, if they could understand how time really worked, maybe there was a way to reverse some of the damage. Maybe they could turn back the clock just enough to make things right. But the more they thought about it, the more they realized how ridiculous it sounded. People didn't have the power to change time, did they? People couldn't just rewrite their past, undo their mistakes, and have a second chance. That wasn't how the world worked. Yet a small part of them refused to let go of the idea. After all, what did they have to lose? They had already wasted so much time. Why not chase this impossible dream? What if it was possible? What if the key to their future lay in understanding the very thing they had taken for granted? It was late one evening when they decided to take the plunge. With only a handful of details and the name of a place whispered in the shadows, they set out to find the man who was said to have the answers. The journey wasn't easy. The road seemed to wind endlessly, and the further they went, the more they began to doubt their decision. They questioned themselves. Was this just another wild goose chase? Were they being foolish to believe in something so far-fetched? The night grew colder as they walked through a narrow alley in an unfamiliar part of town. It was quiet, too quiet, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. They felt like they were being watched. Just as they began to turn around and walk back, they saw it. A door tucked between two old buildings, barely visible. It was the kind of door that could easily be missed if you weren't paying attention. But there it was. Without thinking, they pushed it open. The room inside was dimly lit, filled with the scent of incense and old wood. At first, they couldn't see much. The shadows in the corner seemed to move, and the air was thick with a sense of mystery. But then they saw him, sitting in the middle of the room, calm and still. His eyes, piercing and wise, locked onto theirs the moment they stepped inside. "You're looking for something," the man said, his voice low but sure. They didn't say a word at first. They didn't know what to say. How could they explain the weight on their chest, the desperation in their heart? How could they explain that they were hoping for a miracle? "What if I told you time doesn't work the way you think it does?" the man continued. "What if I told you that it's possible to change your past, not by reversing it, but by understanding it differently?" Their hearts skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. They leaned forward, eager to hear more. "I'm not talking about time travel or any of that nonsense," the man said, sensing their excitement. "What I'm talking about is the power of perception. Time itself is a river, always flowing. You can't stop it, but you can change how you ride the current. The key is in how you view your life. How you understand the moments that have already passed and how you choose to use the moments that are still ahead." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a long moment nothing was said. The ticking of a clock in the corner of the room was the only sound that broke the silence. It was as if the world outside had stopped, leaving them alone in this strange, quiet space, trying to make sense of the man's words. "You're telling me that if I understand time differently, I can change my life?" they asked, still uncertain. The man nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Not just change it. Transform it. But it won't be easy. Changing your relationship with time means confronting your regrets, your failures, and your choices. It means facing the things you've been running from. Are you ready for that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible to answer. They had spent so long avoiding their past, so long pretending that they could just keep moving forward without truly dealing with what was behind them. Could they really confront it all now? Could they face their fears head-on and finally take control of their time? Or would they continue to run, letting time slip away once again. They didn't know the answer yet, but something inside them stirred. This was a chance to do something that could change everything. And they knew deep down that they couldn't walk away from it now. The man's eyes softened, as though he knew they were about to make a decision that would shape the rest of their life. "Time is waiting," he said quietly. "The question is, are you ready to unlock its power?" And with that, the door to a new journey swung open, leading them into the unknown. But what awaited them on the other side? What challenges would they face, and could they truly conquer the power of time? The door creaked shut behind them, and the weight of the man's words lingered in the room, thickening the air like smoke. The flickering candlelight danced around the room, casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe, as if the very space itself was alive with possibility and danger. They felt the stir of something deep within, but it wasn't the thrill of hope. It was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the things they would have to face to understand time, to confront their past, and ultimately to change their future. The man didn't wait for a response. He simply stood up, slowly, his movements deliberate. "There's a price to pay," he said, his voice like gravel grinding together. "No one walks away from this unchanged. Time is not something you control, it controls you. It shapes you, molds you, and when you think you've mastered it, it will remind you that you're still a part of it. We all are." A chill ran down their spine. The words felt heavy, laden with truth and a certain darkness that they hadn't anticipated. They had come seeking answers, desperate to find a way to reclaim what they had lost, but now they were faced with something far greater than they had bargained for. "What do you mean?" they asked, their voice shaking slightly. The man turned to them, his expression unreadable. "You can change how you see your past, how you understand the choices you've made, but you can't rewrite them. You can't erase the pain, the regrets, or the mistakes. They will always be a part of you. Time doesn't forgive, it doesn't forget. And once you step into this, once you decide to confront it, there's no turning back." The words hit harder than they expected. They had come into this with one simple goal: to change their life, to make things right. But now it felt like they were staring into an abyss, knowing that whatever they did next would echo through the rest of their life. The stakes had grown higher than they ever imagined. Could they truly face the ghosts of their past? Could they live with the consequences of unburying the things they had long tried to forget? Before they could respond, the man spoke again. "Time is never just about the individual. It's about the people around you too. Your choices affect others, just as their choices affect you. The key is understanding the impact, the ripples that spread out from every action, every decision. Sometimes, we don't see the consequences until it's too late." They didn't understand what he meant, but something in his tone told them that the path ahead wasn't going to be as straightforward as they had hoped. The power to change time, to change their life, wasn't about having control. It was about understanding the interconnectedness of everything, the choices that had been made, and the consequences yet to come. The man took a step closer, his voice soft but insistent. "I'll show you something. But once you see it, you'll never be able to forget. Are you ready for that?" They hesitated, uncertainty swirling in their chest like a storm. What did it mean to see the truth? To understand the power of time fully? Would they regret it? Would they be able to live with what they uncovered? But then, almost as if it was a reflex, they nodded. They had already come this far. There was no turning back now. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook, its pages worn and yellowed with age. He handed it over, his fingers brushing theirs briefly. "This will guide you," he said. "Inside you'll find stories. Real stories. Stories of people who have, at one point or another, realized the power of time. Some of them were able to harness it. Others not so much. The thing is, every choice we make, every moment we live, is like a thread woven into the fabric of existence. Once you start pulling, you'll see the whole tapestry." They opened the notebook, their fingers trembling as they skimmed through the pages. The stories were unsettling, each one about someone who had sought to change their life, to rewrite their history, but at a terrible cost. There was the woman who tried to turn back time to save her family, only to lose everything else in the process. The man who sought redemption by altering the path he had taken, but in doing so, erased the very people he had hoped to protect. And the child who tried to stop a tragedy from occurring, but ended up creating a ripple that altered the course of the future in ways no one could have foreseen. Every story seemed to end in tragedy or sorrow, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships, lost opportunities, and unanswered questions. It was as if the more they tried to manipulate time, the more they became trapped by it, caught in a web of their own making. The tension grew, pulling tighter and tighter around them as they read on. Finally they closed the book, their heart racing. These people. They failed, didn't they? The man's eyes darkened. They didn't fail. They learned, in the hardest way possible. Time doesn't forgive mistakes, but it does allow us to learn from them. To understand the true power of time, you need to see the cost. You need to be willing to pay it. But the question lingered in their mind, unanswered. Was the cost worth it? Could they face the consequences of confronting their past, of seeing time in a way they had never imagined before? Or would they lose everything in the process? Outside, the wind began to howl, a storm brewing on the horizon. The clock on the wall ticked louder, its hands moving ever forward, never pausing, never slowing. It felt as though the world itself was closing in on them, each passing second a reminder that time was not something to be controlled. It was something to be respected, feared, and understood. The man's voice cut through the silence, breaking their thoughts. A choice is yours. But remember this, once you take this step, there's no going back. You'll see things for what they are, and that knowledge will change you forever. They swallowed hard, their mind racing. Could they face what was coming? Could they truly unlock the power of time, knowing that it would change everything? They didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. The storm was coming, and they had no idea what it would bring. And so, with a heart full of uncertainty and a mind torn between fear and hope, they made their choice. They stood there, the weight of the notebook still heavy in their hands, its pages filled with the echoes of those who had tried and failed to alter their destinies. The room around them seemed to shrink with each passing second, the air thickening with a tension that made it hard to breathe. Every part of them screamed to run, to turn around and leave this place. Leave the man, leave the power that beckoned them with the promise of change, but they couldn't. Something deep inside kept them rooted to the spot, an invisible force urging them to press forward, to take the next step. The storm outside raged louder, the wind howling against the walls, the rain beating against the windows like a warning. Time, it seemed, was closing in. The man didn't say another word. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, urging them to make a choice they couldn't put off any longer. The question was no longer if they were ready, but whether they could handle the truth of what lay ahead. Every fiber of their being trembled as they opened the notebook once more. This time they didn't just read the stories. They felt them, felt the anguish, the desperation, the weight of choices made in the heat of the moment. Every line of ink seemed to pulse with a life of its own, drawing them in, revealing the full consequences of those who had dared to play with time. The woman who tried to save her daughter by erasing the moment of tragedy, only to see the child's life unravel in another unimaginable way. The man who thought he could fix his broken relationship by changing the course of an argument, only to have the distance between him and his partner grow so vast, so unbridgeable, that there was no coming back. The child who tried to stop an accident, only to see an even worse fate befall those they loved. The stories weren't just warnings, they were prophecies. They knew, in that moment, that the choices they had made in the past had already set things in motion. This was no longer about finding a way to undo what was done. It was about understanding the ripple effects, the consequences that would unfold with every step they took. The power to change time wasn't a gift. It was a curse, one that came with a price they might not be willing to pay. They could feel the storm rising within themselves, a sense of fear mixed with a deep yearning to change, to fix the broken parts of their life. But they also felt the weight of the unknown. How could they even begin to comprehend what was truly at stake? What if they couldn't live with the consequences of the power they sought? The man's voice broke through the whirlwind of thoughts, cutting through the chaos with a single phrase. It's time. They felt the ground beneath them shift, a tremor running through their legs as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. They took a hesitant step forward, the weight of the decision pressing down on them like 1,000 pounds. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching further, as if time itself was conspiring to push them into something they weren't ready for. The man reached out, his hand steady, his eyes unwavering. Once you step into this, you'll see the threads. You'll see the moments that connect everything, the choices that led to this very moment. You won't be able to ignore it. Time will no longer be a line, a straight path from past to future. It will become a web, and you'll see all the paths you could have taken, all the ones you didn't. And you'll feel every loss, every regret, every decision that brought you here. The air grew colder, and they could feel their pulse quicken. This was it. This was the point of no return. The decision would change everything. What if I can't handle it? They whispered, the words barely audible in the stillness. What if I see too much? The man's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. You won't know until you try. But remember, the truth is not always a gift. It's not always what we expect. With a shaking hand, they handed the notebook back to him, their heart pounding. The tension in the room was suffocating now, each beat of their heart a drum of dread and anticipation. The man took the notebook, nodding silently, as though he had known this would happen. Then, without a word, he led them to a small table in the center of the room, where a strange device stood, something that looked like a clock, but more intricate, more alive. The gears inside it spun in an impossible, erratic pattern, as if they were alive, as if they had a mind of their own. The device hummed softly, the vibrations sending a shiver through their body. Time, it seemed, was in motion, and it was beckoning them closer. This is the key, the man said, his voice low. It will show you the moments that matter, the ones that shaped your path. It will show you the ones you can change, the ones that are too far gone, and the ones that can never be undone. But be warned, you can't unsee what you see. They reached out, trembling, their fingers brushing the cold metal of the device. The gears inside shifted, clicking together, and the hum grew louder, more insistent. The device began to glow, a soft, golden light spilling out from within. The air in the room seemed to shimmer, and the walls faded into the background. Time itself seemed to bend, to warp, pulling them into a space where the past and future collided. Then it happened. They were no longer in the room. They were no longer in the present. They were floating, weightless, suspended in the very fabric of time itself. The world around them shifted like liquid, like smoke, as they saw flashes, fragments of their past, their future, moments they had long forgotten and ones they hadn't yet experienced. They saw the paths they had taken, the decisions that had led them here, and the choices they would have to make. Each one, each moment, was a thread that wove through the tapestry of their life. But with each flash, the tension grew, and the fear rose higher. They saw the people they had hurt, the opportunities they had missed, and the ones they had taken for granted. They saw themselves, broken, lost, and searching for a way out. The weight of it all threatened to drown them, to pull them under. And in the midst of it all, one question echoed louder than anything else. Was it too late to change? But before they could answer, the light grew blinding, and the world around them shattered. The blinding light consumed them, swallowing everything in its path, until there was nothing left but the overwhelming silence of uncertainty. Their mind raced, unable to grasp what had just happened, unable to anchor themselves in the chaos that now surrounded them. They reached out, feeling only the emptiness, the nothingness, as if time itself had stopped, suspended, frozen, waiting for something they couldn't yet understand. But then, in a split second, the light flickered and vanished. The world snapped back into focus, not in the way they expected, but in a way that felt all wrong. They weren't in the same room. They weren't even in the same place. The ground beneath them felt different, colder, more unfamiliar. The air smelled sharper, as though it had been untouched by time, as though it had been waiting for them to arrive. They looked around, their heart pounding in their chest, and realized with a shock that they weren't alone. Figures, shadows really, stood around them watching. But these weren't just any shadows. They were too real, too solid. These were people, real people from their past, from moments they thought were long gone. They saw faces they hadn't seen in years, faces they had avoided, faces they had lost. There was their mother, looking younger than they remembered, standing across from them, her eyes filled with a strange sadness. There was an old friend, one they hadn't spoken to in forever, standing by her side, his expression unreadable. And there was someone they hadn't thought about in years, someone they had tried so hard to forget. The ground shifted again, and suddenly, they weren't just surrounded by faces from the past. They were in the past. It was as if they had been transported to another time, another place, one that was far from the future they thought they were heading toward. They were standing in the middle of an old, abandoned street, one they recognized all too well. It was the street where they had grown up, where everything had started. The houses were familiar, but somehow wrong, slightly out of place, as if they had been pieced together from fragments of memory. The sky overhead was heavy, dark with the weight of something impending, something they couldn't quite grasp. "Why am I here?" they whispered, their voice barely audible against the wind that began to pick up around them. No one answered. Instead, the figures moved toward them, their faces drawn in a mix of confusion and recognition. It was as if they had been waiting for them, just as much as they had been waiting for this moment. And yet, despite the familiarity, everything felt distant, like a dream, like something that could slip away at any moment. Then, one of the shadows stepped forward, the figure of their mother. Her eyes locked onto theirs, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The noise, the tension, the world itself, all of it disappeared, leaving only her gaze. And in that gaze, they saw something they hadn't expected. A warning. "Plea. You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice breaking the silence with an edge of fear that sent a chill racing down their spine. "What do you mean?" they asked, panic beginning to rise in their chest. "Where is this? What is happening?" But before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the air, a sound so sudden and so jarring that it froze them in place. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the sky seemed to darken even more, swirling with a storm they couldn't understand. It was as though everything was beginning to unravel, as though the fabric of time was fraying at the edges, and they were at the center of it all. In the distance, they saw something that made their blood run cold, a figure cloaked in shadow moving toward them. It wasn't just any figure. It was a reflection of themselves. Only, this version of them was different. Darker. Angrier. Person who had never known peace, who had never known hope. This was the version of them that time had shaped into something unrecognizable, someone driven by regret and loss. The figure reached out toward them, its hands outstretched, and their heart pounded in their chest. "Run!" their mother cried, but it was too late. The shadow version of themselves was already too close. The tension in the air was unbearable, the storm crackling with an energy that was almost alive. The world around them shifted again, and they were no longer on the street, no longer surrounded by the figures from their past. Now they were in a different place entirely, a place that felt like an in-between, like a moment frozen in time. There was no light here, no warmth, only cold, empty space that stretched out infinitely, suffocating them with its vastness. "What is this?" they shouted into the nothingness, their voice echoing, bouncing off the void. But there was no answer, no sign of the shadows, no sign of anything but the crushing emptiness. It was then they realized the truth. This was the heart of time itself. The place where all decisions converged, where every action rippled outward and shaped the future in ways no one could anticipate. This was the moment of choice, the moment of reckoning, and they were standing at the center of it with no idea of what would happen next. The storm continued to rage in their mind, each passing second a reminder of how fragile everything was. They were on the edge, teetering between the past they had known and the future they didn't understand. The stakes were higher than they could fathom, and the conflict inside them grew stronger with every breath. Could they really change the past? Could they stop the dark version of themselves from taking over? Or had they already gone too far, already crossed a line they could never uncross? And then, just as they were beginning to lose all sense of control, the shadows began to close in again, and the only thing they could hear was the ticking of the clock, the relentless, unforgiving sound of time echoing in the darkness. The question remained: would they survive the storm? Or would they be consumed by the very force they had tried to control? The answer seemed farther away than ever before, slipping out of their grasp as the world around them spiraled toward its inevitable conclusion. The ticking of the clock grew louder, more insistent, as if every passing second was an eternity, pressing down on them with unbearable force. Their breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as the shadows closed in, their presence suffocating, a relentless reminder of the dark version of themselves that they feared would consume everything they had worked for. Time had become an enemy, a force that bent and twisted with each choice they made, each path they tried to avoid. They stood at the edge of an invisible precipice, teetering on the brink of everything they had ever known. And yet, it felt like they were falling, spinning out of control. The storm inside them raged, a tornado of emotions that threatened to tear them apart. They had to make a decision. The stakes had never been higher. For a moment, they thought they saw the dark version of themselves, staring back at them, unblinking, with eyes filled with contempt, with all the anger and bitterness that they had tried so hard to bury. It was everything they feared, everything they had run from. The version of themselves that had given in to the darkness, that had allowed time to break them. They had come so close to becoming that person, to losing themselves completely. But then a flash of light broke through the storm, flickering, fragile, like a beacon calling them back from the edge. It was their mother's face, her eyes filled with love, with understanding. It was the reminder they needed, the truth they had been overlooking. "You have the power to change," she whispered, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "But not by running from yourself. Not by trying to fix what's already done. Change starts with acceptance, with understanding. Only then can you change the path ahead." In that moment everything shifted. The shadows, the ticking clock, the storm, all of it seemed to fade into the background as clarity washed over them. Time wasn't something to be controlled, it was something to be understood. The past couldn't be undone, but the future, that was still theirs to shape. They realized the truth. They had been fighting time, but they should have been fighting the fear within themselves. The fear that they weren't enough, that they couldn't handle the consequences of their choices. The dark figure lunged toward them, its hands reaching out, but they didn't flinch. Instead they stood their ground, their hearts steady. They faced the shadow, not with fear, but with resolve. Time had thrown everything at them, regret, loss, uncertainty. But they knew now that the only way forward was to embrace all of it. Every decision, every moment had led them here, and they would no longer run from it. They would face it, and in doing so, they would finally understand the power of time. The darkness dissipated, unraveling like a tapestry being torn apart. The storm calmed, the ticking of the clock slowing to a halt, as though the very universe had exhaled in relief. And just as they thought the world had settled, a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered from the shadows. "Congratulations. You've passed the test." They turned, but no one was there. Only the soft echo of the words lingered in the air. Didn't make sense. What test? They hadn't been aware of any test. All they had wanted was to change, to fix their mistakes, to make things right. But now, standing in the silence, they realized something unsettling. This wasn't over. The conflict had been resolved, yes, but something else had shifted. A deeper, more profound realization that time had not just tested them, but had been testing them all along. The room began to fade again, the shadows slipping into the corners, the edges of reality warping once more. And for a moment they felt a pull, a force stronger than any they had felt before. It was a call to action, to move forward into the unknown, into a new chapter of their life. The past, the future, the present, it was all connected. They had learned to embrace time, but now it was time to truly live with it. Just before the light consumed them again, they heard a final, unexpected sound, a click. It was the sound of a lock, a door opening to something new. The darkness, the shadows, the fear, it was all still there, waiting to return. But now they were different. They had learned the most crucial lesson of all. Time was not an enemy, but a companion. A force to be respected, not feared. And they were ready. As they stepped into the unknown, the light flashed one final time, and the world around them collapsed into nothingness. But one thing remained. A ticking clock. And this time, it was not just a reminder of what had been. It was a promise of what was yet to come. The world around them shifted again, but this time there was no panic, no fear. Just an overwhelming sense of clarity, like stepping into a new reality they hadn't quite known they were ready for. As the light faded, they found themselves standing in a quiet, peaceful place. It was an ordinary space. No storm, no chaos. Just stillness. The ticking of the clock had slowed, almost as if it too was taking a breath, waiting. They glanced around, and for the first time in a long time, they saw the world without the weight of uncertainty. The darkness had been swallowed up by their own understanding. The shadow version of themselves had dissolved, replaced by something new, something they could live with. The tension in their chest eased, and they took a deep breath, grounding themselves in the present. They had made it through. The past hadn't been erased, nor could it be. They had learned that some things couldn't be undone. But they had finally understood that the mistakes, the regrets, were all part of the journey. The key wasn't to change what had happened but to change how they viewed it. The past no longer held them captive. They had learned to live with it, to accept it, and in doing so they had freed themselves. Their mother's words echoed in their mind. Change starts with acceptance. It wasn't just the past that needed to be embraced. It was every moment, every choice, every single second that had led them here. Time had shaped them, yes, but they were not its victim. They were its witness. They were its creator, just as much as it had shaped them. And so, with the final flicker of the light, they walked forward. The feeling of the unknown was still there, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like an invitation, a promise that the future, whatever it might hold, was theirs to shape. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about living. About embracing each moment as it came, knowing that time, with all its power, had also given them the ability to change, to grow, and to move forward. As they stepped out of the quiet space, they found themselves back in the world they had once known, the familiar streets, the familiar faces. Everything was as it should be, but it felt different. They felt different. The weight they had carried for so long was gone. The fear was gone. And in its place was something far more powerful, hope. The lessons they had learned weren't just about time. They were about themselves. About accepting the things they couldn't control and embracing the things they could. About recognizing that even in the darkest moments, there was always light waiting to break through. And most importantly, about understanding that change didn't come from running away from the past. It came from making peace with it, and in that peace, finding the strength to build a better future. As the day stretched into evening, they looked up at the sky. The ticking of the clock had stopped, but they could still feel its rhythm inside them. Time, in all its complexity, was still there, but it no longer ruled their life. They were ready to live in harmony with it, not as its prisoner, but as its equal. With a sense of calm settling over them, they turned and walked down the path that stretched out before them. It wasn't a perfect path. It wasn't a path without challenges. But it was their path, and they would walk it step by step, knowing that they had everything they needed to navigate the twists and turns ahead. As they continued on, they thought about the things they had learned. The power of time, the strength of acceptance, and the importance of moving forward, no matter how daunting the road seemed. It wasn't always easy to see the way ahead, and it wasn't always clear what the future would hold. But they had learned that every second was a chance to change, to grow, to make a difference. And so, they walked into the future, knowing that while time might never be fully understood, it was theirs to embrace. The journey was just beginning. In that quiet moment, as they took another step forward, they realized that the real power wasn't in controlling time, but in living fully within it. Time wasn't something to be feared or manipulated. It was something to be respected, to be understood, and most of all to be lived. The final twist, the final truth was clear. The real power lay in knowing that the moments we live are all we truly have. And it was up to them, and to all of us, to make those moments count. The world faded to black, but in their heart, the ticking of the clock never stopped.